Welcome back to this study of the life of Christ. We want to continue on now with class 13B, and we're looking at the ministry and the last days of John the Baptist in this half of the class. Let's go over, if we can, to Matthew chapter 14, and we'll begin reading in verse 1 to get some background about this. You remember that John has been exercising his ministry as he was supposed to. He has spoken to people. He has baptized many people. He's baptized Jesus, and he's recognized, as we see in places like John chapter 3, that his time is now drawing to an end, and his ministry should diminish, and that Jesus should increase. And so there's no jealousy involved. He's not working against Jesus. He's actively trying to bring more spotlight to Jesus and deliver people over to follow Jesus. So as his ministry is going on, he begins to have trouble with people because he's speaking so clearly and so directly about things and confronting sin that it's not always popular. And so in chapter 14, it says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch, this is Herod Antipas, heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now, if you're reading this story, you're saying, wait, did John the Baptist die? So Matthew goes back and explains how that happened, or how he got in prison. Now, Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother, King Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him a prophet. Okay, so you have the instance that landed John in prison. He was criticizing Herod's infidelity and his adultery. And so we don't know exactly how long John was in prison, but we know that he was left alive because he was kind of afraid of how the people might react if they killed him. So it could have been weeks or even months that John is in prison. He's finished his ministry outside. He's in prison now, and then we know the end of the story that's coming a little bit later. So John is put in prison because of his confronting Herod. Then, if you go over to Matthew 11, we're going to skip around a little bit because we're trying to tell the story in chronological order. In 11, 2 through 6, this is one we read when we talked about Remez, but let's go ahead and refresh it here. It says, when John the Baptist heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me." Now, if you look at this story and you think, okay, John is the one who prepared the way for Jesus. He's convinced that he's the Messiah, the one who is to come. He calls Jesus the Lamb of God in John 1 when he sees him. He talks about how much greater Jesus is than he is and how much greater Jesus' ministry will be, John 3 as well. And so he is convinced of Jesus' identity. So you say, if he's that convinced, and if he announced to everyone, even to Jesus, this is the guy, then why is he beginning to question here if Jesus is the one who was to come? It seems a little bit odd. And I kind of wonder if it's not just a human tendency. When things don't go perhaps as we've expected, then maybe we begin to question and think, did I misunderstand? Perhaps I was wrong about this. Perhaps it's somebody else or some other way. Because I think if you look at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, John hears stories about what's going to happen. And you compare what Jesus did in his ministry and how he treated people with what John said was going to happen in Matthew 3 and Luke 3. John talked about a man who would come with an axe at the root of the tree, and talks about wooding fork and fire, just a really brusque description of who the Messiah would be. And so all of a sudden he hears Jesus is coming, and he is kind, and he's compassionate, and he's turning the other cheek, and he's forgiving people that should be stoned, maybe John chapter 8. And perhaps he's thinking, is this the Messiah that I thought was going to come? Maybe there's another Messiah. maybe Jesus is an excellent teacher, but maybe not the Messiah. And so, as we talked about in the class before, he asked, are you the one who was to come? In code, like a remez, are you the Messiah? Or maybe is there someone else coming? Some people have suggested that John understood, but he understood in part, that Christ is the Messiah. He is the one who was to come. But he came the first time in compassion, and that's the part that confused John. And he's going to come the second time in his second coming in judgment, and then he'll have the judgment and the fire and the axe and the final disposition of everyone. And so he is both. He's the Messiah coming two different times in two different ways. And perhaps John is expecting the coming of judgment instead of the coming of compassion. So I thought that was a pretty good way to understand it. So again, as we mentioned, there's this remez here about, are you the one who is to come? And specifically, it talks about Zechariah chapter 2 and Zechariah chapter 9, which actually is also connected with Jesus' triumphal entry on a donkey. So both of those talk about the king who is coming, and that's the code here. Are you the Messiah? And basically, he's not only asking that, but he's also asking if he's going to liberate the Jews and free the captives like him, because that was one of the main tasks of the Messiah, is bring freedom to the oppressed, bring freedom to the prisoners. And so John is thinking about the Romans oppressing the people. He's thinking about the fact that he's in prison. He's thinking, if you're the Messiah, Jesus, should I expect that I'll get out of prison and that the Romans will be defeated? Again, perhaps not understanding the full scope or the kind of ministry that Jesus had. And so Jesus answers in a couple of ways. First of all, he answers yes to the first. Yes, I am the Messiah. And as we mentioned the other day, and we talked about remez, he has a number of quotes from the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah 35, verse 6, it talks about the lame walking and the mute speaking. In Psalm 146, 8, in Isaiah 42, 7, it talks about giving sight to the blind. And actually the verse before, Isaiah 42, 6, mentions the captives being set free. But Jesus doesn't quote that one. And then in Isaiah 58, 7 and 61, 1, it talks about how the Messiah will treat the poor, bringing good news and refuge to the poor. And it also says, and freedom for the captives. But again, Jesus doesn't quote that piece. And so he answers, yes, I am the Messiah. And yes, I'm doing a lot of things the Messiah is going to do. But no, because I'm not freeing all the captives right now. So in essence, implying to John, you're not going to be set free. You're going to die in prison. And so again, as we mentioned, verse 6 there, blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me, an encouragement for John to remain faithful, even though he doesn't get out. And so if you go on here into the next section, continuing in verse 7, as John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. What did you go out into the desert to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in king's palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. And so again, it's a reference to John's mission mentioned in Isaiah. And later on, Jesus will say, yes, he is the Elijah who was to come before the Messiah, as the Jews would understand. Verse 11, I tell you the truth. Among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John. And if you're willing to accept it, here it is, he is the Elijah who was to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, this is an amazing statement about John and his mission. All these wonderful things he says about John. Yes, he is a prophet, and that's what you should expect when you go out into the desert. And then he says, really an amazing thing, verse 11, among those born of women, there's not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. You think about that just for a minute. Who's come before John that have been born of women, which is everybody? Moses, one of the greatest prophets, most humble men, man of power, brought the law. Abraham, father of all who believe, receiver of the promises, the covenant with God. David, King David, one of the most powerful kings, a man after God's own heart. And we're not even mentioning people like Job and Noah and Daniel and all they did, and all the godly women as well. We see the whole stretch of the Old Testament, and Jesus looks at all that and says, there's been no one born among women who is greater than John the Baptist. That's amazing. And so if you're John and that somehow gets back to you, that's got to be an affirmation that you have been faithful and fulfilled your mission. And then Jesus adds this, and at first it seems like a slap in the face, but it's not. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John. And it's not devaluing John in any way. It's not an insult to John, saying even the least are better than you, John. What he's saying is John was pointing toward me coming and the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. And those who come into the kingdom have great value because they now are part of the kingdom. And so it's not that the people in the kingdom have done greater things than John or anything. It's just that that's how important the kingdom is. That's how important it is to become a part of the kingdom, because you are now in relationship with God, relationship with the Son of God, with all that means. And then you think about John's mission, and John would be in agreement with this. You look at all the law and the prophets point to John, the Elijah who was to come, mentioned in Malachi 3:1 and chapter 4, verse 5. And so John gets here and he fulfills everything just as he should. And then what does John do? He points to Jesus and says, he's the guy you should really pay attention to. He must increase, I must decrease. He is greater than me. And so John has fulfilled his mission perfectly. Now, before we go on to the end of John's life, I want to pick out one other phrase out of this section here. In verse 12, I don't know what version you're reading from. I was reading from the 1984 NIV version when I read before, when it says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. Now, there's a puzzle here, because in Greek, there are three words here that give at least two, but maybe as many as four possible translations of this phrase, depending on what meanings you take out of the words, okay? And the words we're looking at there are phrases, forcefully advancing, forceful men, and then lay hold. Okay, those three ideas. So you have biadzo, which if you take a more positive interpretation, you take one of the positive meanings, it's to give great effort. You have biastes, is a person who is strong, these forceful men, one who is strong, but that uses it for good. And then you have arpazo, the idea of laying hold. You can take hold of something with great anticipation or acquire something with strength. In other words, you look at these three words and these three meanings selected, they're the positive meanings. So it speaks of a forceful, good action, a strong action, okay? So if you took these positive interpretations or definitions, then you could translate it, as the NIV does here, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it, which is true, right? Because the kingdom is forcefully advancing in many different ways through the ministry of Jesus and John and the apostles, and forceful men lay hold of it. And in that case, it's a good thing. People are laying hold of the kingdom. It's important to them, and so they're doing everything they can to lay hold of the kingdom and be faithful to God. So again, that's a really positive interpretation, and so that's what you see in this interpretation in John, this translation. But if there are other meanings of these same three words in Greek, and it's possible to take the negative meanings and come up with different translations, okay? So for example, biazo also can be translated to use violent force. Biastes can also refer to a violent man, not just a forceful man. And arpazo can mean to seize violently, not with strength necessarily, but violently. You're going to force your way or your will upon somebody. And so those are all a lot more negative. And so if you took the negative meanings of this, then you have this translation, and from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. Now that is completely different than the NIV translation, and it's a possible translation. The New King James is the one that has this one. You think of, instead of forcefully advancing, suffers violence. That's quite a difference. Instead of forceful men, it's violent men. And instead of laying hold, it's take it by force, like it's ripped away from you. So again, this is another possible translation. And if you look at it, there's elements that are true of this as well. The kingdom of heaven did suffer violence, okay? And there are violent men who are attacking the kingdom of heaven and trying to take it by force. So again, you think, well, which is right? It's a little bit of a puzzle. I think that perhaps some people have tried to combine meanings, and maybe in a combined meaning is the best possibility for arriving at an understanding. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence. Okay, so that's kind of negative. And forceful people lay hold of it. That's a little better. Even though you're in the middle of violence, if you're strong, then you can come into the kingdom of heaven. Now, there's truth in that. But there's also a little bit of a problem when you think about who gets into the kingdom, and Jesus talks about the last and the least and the weakest, the ones that don't matter. You know, Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 talks about, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were rich or strong or anything. And so the idea that only forceful people could get into the kingdom is not totally accurate either. So we don't necessarily understand it entirely that way. That's the Net Bible. And then another combination is from the New Living Translation. And from the time John the Baptist began preaching until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, in other words, making progress, and violent people are attacking it. And again, there's elements of truth to that as well. And I want to suggest that perhaps this last translation may fit the best. It's kind of a combination of the positives and the negatives. It allows all the good, and yet it doesn't necessarily deny any of the principles we see in the context, the wider context. For example, if you go on around Matthew 11 and you see what's happening in the greater context of Matthew 11, just before then, chapter 10 spoke of persecution and killing and swords. And so you get the violent people attacking, okay? Jesus and John in their ministries suffered opposition. And so again, you have that truth, and both of them would end up being martyrs. Okay. And then you have the idea of God gives us the kingdom. We don't take it by force, right? We don't have to necessarily be strong to enter this kingdom. Even the weak can enter this kingdom. Even the least, even the poor, even the slaves, even the outcasts like women in adultery and Samaritans and tax collectors and prostitutes and all these things, the weak enter the kingdom. And so you consider all the possible meanings of the verbs and all the context here, and this one seems to make sense. The kingdom of heaven is coming on strong, and even though it's suffering attacks, then you can still get into the kingdom of heaven. And then if you're in the kingdom of heaven, then you're even greater than John the Baptist, because the kingdom of heaven is so great. So interesting idea. Just wanted to mention that. That's fairly unusual in the number of different translations you can have. But as you work through those different translations, you also get more and more flavor and texture of what's going on in this text, and more understanding of the greater context, how it fits. Now let's go on through the next part of Matthew 11, verse 16. So what can I compare this generation, Jesus says? They're like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others, We played the flute for you, but you didn't dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her actions. And so Jesus is rebuking the people here. He's saying, you really don't understand what you're talking about, who John was or what he did. You don't understand my ministry either, who I am or what I'm doing here. And in essence, this is true. We see this all the time in our worlds, in our communities, in our churches, that people often aren't satisfied with anything. They ask for one thing, they get it, and they're not satisfied. They ask for more. They ask for one thing, they don't get it, they gripe and complain even more. Jesus comes, and he doesn't match their expectations at all. And so they complain. Why do you do this and not this? Why do you spend time with the sinners and not with others? Why don't you wash your hands? Why don't you fast more? And all these things, they don't match. He doesn't match their expectations. They want him really to adjust to them instead of them adjusting to him. And Jesus is not going to do that. And so he goes about his ministry, and gradually they learn more who he is and what he expects of them. Now, to finish the story of John the Baptist, let's go back to Matthew 14 and beginning in verse 6. Let me get over there just one second. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist. The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. Just a really sad story, and I guess the saddest is how people reacted or should have reacted, where he talks about a promise that he made, and his dinner guest, Herod wasn't strong enough to resist and say, this is not the right thing to do. And so he has John the Baptist killed. And you look at Herodias and her daughter, Salome or Salome, whichever way you want to say that, and how blind they are and how vengeful they are that they would want to kill a man just because he had offended them. So there's a lot of sadness in this story, and sadness that John, a faithful man of God, a brave man of God, had to die in this way. And obviously when Jesus heard what had happened, it made him sad, and that's why we see in the next verse he wants to withdraw and get away from people. Because John was his cousin, and Jesus appreciated who he had been and what he had done. So, sorry to leave you behind in the notes there just a little bit. So you go on and you see a couple of pictures toward the end here. This place here is on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. You can kind of see part of the Dead Sea in the background here. It's a place called Machaerus. And it's likely the place where John the Baptist was held in prison, and where Herod had a palace and kind of a fortress where he had his birthday party, and then where John was killed. If you go up on top of this, you see part of the structure that remains from Herod's palace overlooking the Dead Sea. And so you can kind of imagine what it must have been like for John to be here and just wait to send messengers from here and hear back from Jesus, as we read about in Matthew 11, and then just wait to find out how he was going to die. So he did. He was faithful, and Jesus praises John. There's been no one greater among those born of women than John the Baptist. Great words from Jesus. Hope this has been helpful for you to be able to look at the life and ministry of John the Baptist all in one class, and then we'll move on to other aspects of Jesus' ministry in the next class. God bless you. See you next time.